Congregation may be seated. As some of you may recall, I began my sermon on Easter Sunday by talking about various phobias. This morning, I would like to add one additional one to that list: Japhirophobia, or the fear of crossing bridges. And while I have personally known some individuals who suffered from that fear, I have always been just the opposite. I am completely fascinated by bridges, and I marvel at the construction or the effort that goes in to constructing them. And knowing that some of our members once lived in Michigan, and knowing that we sometimes, including today, have guests from Michigan, I looked up some information about the Mackinac Bridge, the bridge that connects the lower and upper peninsulas, a bridge that perhaps some of you have crossed at one point. I learned that the Mackinac Bridge is 5 miles in length, and that it weighs slightly more than 1 million tons. To construct the bridge, it took 350 engineers and some 3,500 workers at the bridge site. Was it worth that extraordinary effort? I would argue yes. Since the bridge first opened in 1957, more than 150 million vehicles have crossed the bridge. And thankfully, for those who actually suffer from Japhirophobia, they actually have designated drivers who will take you across the Mackinac Bridge for free. The reason I begin with this is because as I look at our first lesson for today, it occurs to me that the Apostle Paul was building a bridge in a metaphorical sense. And while our lesson begins in the 22nd chapter, or 22nd verse of the 17th chapter of Acts, this particular story actually begins 6 verses earlier, where we learn that Paul has arrived in Athens from Thessalonica, and he is waiting for Silas and Timothy to join him. Not wanting to waste time until their arrival, Paul decides that he is going to walk around the city. And what he sees was not to his liking. Luke records for us, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. The city was filled with temples and shrines to various gods, one to Athena, one to Diana, one to Mars, one to Zeus. One Greek historian once wrote, "It is easier to find a god in Athens than a human." And for a Jewish Christian like Paul, a strict monotheist for whom graven images were strictly forbidden, it must have been difficult for him to be in a city so filled with gods. It's no wonder that he was deeply distressed by what he saw. and based on what Paul witnessed in Athens, and knowing his stubborn and uncompromising manner, I find it somewhat surprising that Paul did not berate the Athenians for their foolishness, chastise them for their polytheistic beliefs, or simply detach himself from these quote-unquote pagans. But interestingly, Luke informs us that Paul does none of those things. Instead, we are told that Paul took it to the streets. He went to the place where people assembled to share their ideas. In other words, Paul engaged the people. He went about trying to build a bridge. And an important first step for Paul was to establish some common ground. And so Paul tells them, Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. In sharing these words, Paul began by creating some common ground, affirming some things that he and they could agree on. And in doing so, he gave himself the chance to be heard further. As I reflect on Paul's approach, it occurs to me that there is much that we can learn from him. For as I consider the context in which we live today, it seems that we have much in common with Athens of the first century. Now, granted, we don't have temples to Venus or shrines to Jupiter any longer, but we continue to live in a pluralistic society, one that has a variety of belief systems. And so it seems to me that as the church, we have the ability to take the same approach that Paul did with the Athenians. We could berate people for their ignorance, or we could detach ourselves from quote-unquote heathen. Or, like Paul, we can engage the community around us. We can try to build bridges to them. And as we consider what approach we might take, let us first take a look at the rest of Paul's story in Athens. After establishing that common ground, Paul then goes on to engage his audience further. What you worship as unknown, he says, this I proclaim to you. He then stretches their current beliefs by professing the biblical concept that there is only one God, the creator of heaven and earth. One God who made all humans. One God who is closer to them than they realize. One God who is the Father of all people. One God who desires them to repent and to turn their lives toward Him. And finally, without apology, Paul gets around to declaring to them the message of Jesus Christ. God will have the world judged in righteousness, he says, by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Having built the bridge to connect with the Athenians, Paul then invites them to take the next step, to cross over that bridge, to go beyond simply being religious, and to put their trust in the God who has raised his Son from the dead. And what was the result of Paul's evangelistic effort that day? Luke writes, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, we will hear you again about this. No, not everyone was convinced by Paul's message. No, not everyone was converted to faith in Jesus. But some were eager to hear more of this new message that Paul had to share. And in large measure, I believe, it was because Paul was willing to build that bridge first. As we share our faith with others, Paul's example is one that we can emulate. We are called to share the good news of Jesus Christ, the one who was crucified, the one who has been raised from the dead. But in sharing that message, one that can be hard for people to grasp, one that can be a stumbling block for others, we would be wise to start by building those bridges first. It occurs to me that our festivals are such an attempt on our part to do just that. By inviting people into our church building in a non-threatening way, and then communicating the love of Jesus Christ to them both through our actions and through the message that I share with our children at the end. But of course, building these bridges is nothing new. It is something that God did for us first. For in sending his only Son, God built the ultimate bridge, one that stretched from heaven to earth, one that has reconnected each one of us to God. And was it worth the extraordinary effort? The answer, of course, is yes. For since this bridge opened around 30 AD, countless billions of people have crossed over it, finding forgiveness in Jesus Christ, finding new life in him, and receiving the assurance of life eternal. Yes, thanks be to God, the ultimate bridge builder. Amen.
Amen.